All right, so the second thinker we're going to look at this week um, is the notable German psychologist, psychiatrist, thinker, polymath Carl Jung. And Carl Jung's ideas, in some ways, this week I kind of did things out of order. Carl Jung had a tremendous influence on Joseph Campbell, the guy we talked about in the previous PowerPoint about the hero's journey. You can see by his dates. Um, Campbell died in 1987. Jung died in 1961. He was a full generation before Campbell, and I think it'll become fairly clear fairly quickly how Jung's ideas influenced Campbell. In some ways, Campbell took a lot of Jung's ideas about what he called archetypes and applied them more broadly to religious studies, to narrative, to mythology. And so Jung, he's notable, he's famous, and rightly so for a number of things. But the main thing we're going to focus on today is his development and writings and thoughts about these. Kind of building blocks of narratives, which he called archetypes. Jung, like Campbell, was very interested in mythology, in religious narratives. And like Campbell, he noticed that myths and religious narratives, and Jung in his work as a psychiatrist, particularly kind of dream narratives, he noticed that symbols kept repeating themselves, particular kind of figures, characters in myths, in religious narratives, in dreamscapes, tended to kind of pop up again and again and again. And so he broadly came to the same conclusion that Campbell did, in that he saw that there were things that kind of bound all of these kinds of narratives together around the world. And just like Campbell, he too saw it as a something that kind of bound humanity together in a mysterious, mystical kind of way. And he developed this notion of the collective unconscious. Now, Jung, like Campbell, as far as I understand, he was not religious in any kind of traditional fashion. He was not a practitioner of any of the living religions that we know today. But more of his kind of he saw his ideas as being more kind of universalist, and his idea of the collective unconscious is very complicated and very mysterious. But it's this idea that kind of just bubbling beneath the surface of kind of all of human experience, if we were able to kind of lift that veil, we would see this kind of broad connection amongst humanity. The collective unconscious is this something that's kind of just beyond the grasp of our conscious mind. And so it's a leap of faith to accept this. But it's there that binds all of humanity together. And so I just want to share with you one famous story that illustrates this. So Jung had this idea, and he also argued that every once in a while the universe will indeed lift that veil and give us a peek into kind of how things are connected together. And so tied to this notion is of the collective unconscious is Jung's ideas about what he called synchronicity, which is just a fancy word that means kind of time moving together. And again, this is also a way too complex idea to really get into here. But the idea is that for Jung, there are no coincidences. That what we think are kind of random occurrences, things that you would, on the face of it, scientifically speaking, would have nothing to do with one another. Jung says these are all more deeply connected than we could ever possibly realize this, and so there's a link between things happening on one side of the world. To the things happening on the other side of the world. You may have heard of the kind of term the butterfly effect, and so a famous example is a butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the world, and then a tsunami rages on the other side. And a rational person would say those two things have nothing to do with one another. But Jung would say if we were able to see kind of the connectedness, the chain of connection in the collective unconscious, we would see that those two things could very well be possibly tied together. Now, there's this famous story, the Baum's coat story, and I'll just briefly summarize it here. So the story goes, and as far as I can tell, this is not just apocryphal or folklore. This seems to have happened. Is when the production team was getting ready to film the famous Wizard of Oz film with Judy Garland as Dorothy in 1939, early color film. They were, the designers, the producers were trying to get everything together. Staging, costuming, sets, and all that. And for a particular scene, the director wanted some, kind of older clothing. I think this was for Dorothy's family back in Kansas. And so the director instructed the costume designer, said, go down to the Goodwill store, go down to the secondhand store, see if you can find something that would be usable for these scenes. And so the designer went and picked up a bunch of stuff and came back, and one of the actors was trying on one of these old coats. And they happened to look inside where the pocket is. And indeed, there was a monogram stitched into the pocket showing who the previous owner of the coat was. And the owner of the coat was no other than L. Frank Baum, the author who wrote The Wizard of Oz. And so this story is often used to kind of explain. Jung would, most people say, wow, that's an outrageous coincidence that they happened to stumble upon the author of The Wizard of Oz coat just accidentally while trying to turn his most famous book into a movie. And Jung would say, not at all. That's the universe kind of lifting its veil and giving us a peek into this. All right. Now, the main thing I want to talk about in this presentation is to go through some of these principal archetypes that Jung noticed and that Campbell kind of expanded upon in his hero's journey. And I'm certainly not going to cover them all. I'm giving what I take to be kind of the greatest hits here. But these were kind of what Jung took to be kind of symbols that showed up in dreamscapes, characters that show up in religious narratives, in mythologies, that happen over and over and over again, that Jung says, this can't be a coincidence. There must be something to this. And so the next task is to get underneath it. And what do these symbols mean? So I'm going to share with you some of Jung's kind of ideas. So the first archetype is the child. And this is true. If you look at kind of mythological narratives and ancient cultures, children in story and in culture are often associated with the divine. And I think this has to be, Jung explained it that there's something about children that are pure, uncorrupted, particularly infant children, and it's kind of it's the purest that a human being can be, and then we just kind of get corrupted from there as we grow up and we let the world into our lives and we wrestle with the problems of becoming mature. And so he noticed that the child often becomes a divinely innocent character in these stories, or even kind of maybe a young child, not an infant anymore, but a young boy or a young girl will often speak precociously or kind of be the mouthpiece of prophecy. And this idea that childhood is closer to divinity than adulthood is a very common one. And so you see it in flipped and tweaked and used over and over again, even in our popular culture. One would say that Calvin, from Calvin and Hobbes, is a kind of version of Jung's archetype. Now, certainly, if you know this cartoon, Calvin is not innocent. He's devious and diabolical, but his mind, his vocabulary is precocious. It's one of the things that makes him extraordinary. He's got this overactive mind. So it's his precocity that makes him an archetype here. Or Lisa Simpson from The Simpsons. She, again, if you're familiar with that mythology, Lisa is kind of really kind of the one rational, intellectual mind and voice within that family, and she's well wise beyond her years. She looks as you see her in this cartoon, innocent, pretty, unthreatening, but she has this very precocious mind behind it. Linus from the Peanuts cartoon. If you're familiar with that old comic strip, Linus is the preacher. He's the theologian. He will speak kind of words of wisdom. He is a link to the divine. But the way that Schultz depicted him is that he's also infantile. He carries a blanket and he sucks his thumb, way past the age where one should be sucking one's thumb and carrying a blanket around. Peter Pan, the eternal youth, right? He's stuck in boyhood forever. And so he represents kind of that freedom, that joy. He can literally fly, but the eternal youth. And then Stewie from Family Guy, again, kind of maybe almost a darker version of Calvin, right? He's not innocent, but he is precocious, and he speaks with an older voice and an accented voice, and like he's a diabolical villain in some kind of broad cartoonish drama. Archetype 2, the wise old man. We talked about with Campbell, the mentor figure that comes into the hero's life. This is more or less the same kind of figure. What the Greeks called the sophos, the wise man, or what the ancient Romans called the senex, the old man. A stock character that finds its way into lots of different stories. And again, he sometimes mysteriously appears, mysteriously disappears, but he brings wisdom that the hero needs, that the hero doesn't have. And as we pointed out, the mentor figure, Campbell's mentor figure, Jung's wise old man, is often some kind of magical being, or what we call a liminal being, a term which just means he can cross boundaries that others can't. He can go to other worlds where others can't, and so he's constantly showing up and disappearing in a way that most of the characters in the story can't. So, of course, Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings mythology is a classic wise old man archetype, as would be, several others. Dumbledore from Harry Potter, Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars mythology, Yoda, of course, from that same mythology, all plays into this archetype. In Greek mythology, Odysseus has to go down into the underworld where he finds Tiresias, the blind prophet, who gives him the information he needs on how to take the next steps towards getting home. And also in Greek mythology, there's a centaur, a wise old centaur, Chiron, who lives deep in the woods. And there are stories about Achilles, whom you see here, the great warrior, or Jason of Jason the Argonaut, has to go deep into the woods to learn at the feet of this great figure of deep ancient wisdom. Chiron in the forest. I mean, it's the same thing. Luke going to Yoda to study how to become a Jedi. How is it really any different than Achilles and Jason going deep into the forest to find Chiron to learn his wisdom? Jung and Campbell would say structurally there is no difference. Merlin too, the great wizard from the King Arthur legends too, falls right into this archetype as well. And now, again, the list could go on, and you could probably give me many examples of these kinds of characters in the stuff that you've seen and read and watched. There's also the wise old woman. This figure often will play a similar kind of role to the wise old man, though more unpredictable, more dangerous in some sense. The Greeks recognized this almost as an archetype centuries ago. They called her the Potniatheron, the mistress of animals. So sometimes the wise old woman in these stories is more like the witch in the woods, who's more comfortable with her retinue of animals than she is trafficking with the human world. She can be a guide to the hero, but she's almost always more monstrous in these kinds of stories than the wise old man. And so yes, just like as the male wizard, the female witch associated with magic and sorcery. And so in Greek mythology, a goddess like Artemis certainly falls into this role. She is at home in the woods, at home in the forest, and with her leopards and her stags and her lions and her bears around her more than she is with in the human realm. Others that we've seen, this is another version of Artemis, often associated with kind of fertility. This is a version of Artemis where she has these are actually multiple breasts on her chest there, associated with kind of the earth, the fertility of the earth, the renewal of the earth. Here we see an early figurine of what's likely to be an earth goddess, depicted in a way that kind of emphasizes her fertility and her association with giving birth and nursing. In the Greek story of the Odyssey, if you're familiar with that, Odysseus and his men wash up on the shore of the island of Circe, who is a classic witch in disguise, and she famously turns all of these unlucky travelers that cross her threshold into various animals. Odysseus's men get turned into pigs. Or just kind of think of any kind of crone or witch from a fairy tale. Hansel and Gretel, for example, is another layer of this of this story. Now there are positive examples as well. The fairy godmother from Cinderella, who comes to help the poor beleaguered heroine in that story, is a more kind of female Gandalf, you might call her, or Galadriel from the Tolkien legends from Lord of the Rings. She's an elven kind of quote unquote witch who has powers and gifts to give to the Fellowship to help them on their journey. The trickster. Almost every culture that produces mythology, and every culture does indeed produce mythology. But that mythology that survives, that gets written down, that gets passed down, almost invariably one of their key figures will be the trickster. Um, Cultures revel in this kind of character, someone who can get away with things that normal people can't, someone who is, again, a liminal figure, a boundary crosser, someone who can go to places that we can't, someone who can use his or her mind in a way that we can't. And so we revel in the cleverness, we revel in the trickster's ability to get in and out of situations, to outwit their opponent. So often the trickster is a thief, but it's the thief that you root for. If you think about, you know, the the heist movie as an archetype of its own is something that Hollywood goes back to again and again. If you again, I know this is a bit dated, but if you've seen like the Ocean's 11 movies, they're all structured around some grand heist, the robbing of a Las Vegas casino, and we revel in the preparation and the trickiness and the craftiness and the trickster element that each of those characters brings to the table. And even though they're doing something technically illegal, we root for them. So the trickster character, I mean, has never gone away and continues in our own culture. So again, Greek mythology again, in the beginnings of Western literature, Odysseus is the classic trickster. He's the man who will use his not much to look at. The Greeks described him as being kind of short, hairy, bow-legged, so people don't take him seriously. But you go against him at your own peril. He will outwit you at every turn. And so the trickster can be a hero or a villain. Can kind of cross those lines. It's kind of the gray areas of the trickster that are often make that character interesting. In Native American folklore, the coyote is often plays the role of the trickster. That you don't want the coyote to come to your village, but at the same time you kind of admire what the coyote can get away with. And I think about, if you're familiar with the old Looney Tunes cartoons, Wile E. Coyote is kind of a hapless trickster. He's got all these devious plans, but they always blow up in his face, literally, as he's trying to hunt down the Roadrunner, which he can never capture. So it's kind of an inversion. Here you have the kind of the successful devious trickster in folklore, and here we have the inept trickster whose tricks never work out. In Japanese folklore, and this is also true not just for Japan, but around the world, the fox. The fox, if I were to ask you, what's the literary temperament of the fox, I invariably would say crafty, tricky, sneaky. The fox sneaking into the hen house. It's a classic trickster in an anthropomorphic kind of way, where you have an animal acting like a human. Reynard the fox in French folklore, he's kind of a Odysseus trickster figure as well. Loki in Norse mythology is the grand trickster. In the Marvel movies, they've kind of turned him into kind of a devious, almost mustache twirling villain. But in Norse mythology, he's much more of a kind of a gray area. Can we trust him? Can we not trust him? I suppose some of those elements also play into his Marvel identity as well. The Riddler, as a villain, who is his villainy is rooted in his craftiness. Of course, the Joker too. Who has a long history in comic books and in film, and has been reincarnated a number of times. Very recently, in fact, with Joaquin Phoenix. Here we see the famous depiction by Heath Ledger in the Dark Knight. He's a madman, but again, his genius lies in his deviousness. Archetype of God, right? Think of any religious tradition. I wouldn't say any, but most religious traditions posit some sort of ultimate being at the top of the food chain. This is particularly true, of course, in the monotheistic religion. So here we see this is the name of God in Hebrew. Again, if you know something about Hebrew, you read it not from left to right, but from right to left. And this would be pronounced Yahweh. It's sometimes transliterated as YHWH into English characters. No vowels in Hebrew. You have to they're implied by the consonant that you use. So Yahweh, which means something like I am the one who is, or I am who I am. Simply the ultimate being, as it were. Down here you see the name Allah in Arabic. In ancient Arabic, the name of God in the Islamic tradition. We see the depiction of God in the Renaissance, a very influential painting by Michelangelo from the Sistine Chapel. The center panel, where God comes down to almost, but not quite, touch the hand of Adam at the creation of man. But here depicted, kind of like Zeus, an older, permanently middle-aged, heavily bearded man. And so Michelangelo was heavily influenced, of course, by the classical Greco-Roman culture that preceded him. And this kind of depiction of God as an older man continues to this day. That's kind of entered into our consciousness of, quote unquote, what God looks like, for better or for worse. And so it's still a very live archetype today. Yeah, there's a depiction of a version of Jupiter or Zeus, and there you can see the clear influence of that ancient depiction of what Zeus looked like, quote unquote, to Michelangelo's transferring that to the Christian God. The devil too, as an adversary. If you have a god, if you have a figure of good, it demands kind of an archetype of a figure of evil. Or an adversary. And so, the devil, here we see him in his most kind of cartoonish way, the winged, horned, red, pitchfork-wielding demon. This also likely, the pitchfork likely comes from the staff that was carried by Hades, the god of the underworld and the dead in Greek mythology, but someone who stands in direct opposition to the archetype of the god. And so, the Hebrews, the ancient Jews, called him Satan, literally the adversary or the disruptor. The word devil comes from the Greek word diabolos, which really means to kind of throw in between. It's like, throwing I like to think of it kind of shoving a pole into the spokes of a wheel. The diabolos, the one that disrupts, the one that corrupts, the one that stands against. In Islam as well, monotheistic religion, you have the shaitan, which is basically in the Semitic languages the same word, and there too, here you see in an early Islamic text, you see some of the Arabic up here. You already see some of kind of those classic archetypal depictions of what the devil looks like: horned, fanged, goat-like, as it were. And then, of course, the hero. And I'm not going to dwell on this because we talked about this. Every adventure story, every quest landscape, be it a religious narrative, a mythology, or some kind of coherent dream narrative, there's the hero. Jung, in his, when he collected dream stories from his patients, he always paid attention to what was the dreamer doing in the dream, if they were there at all. Did they kind of fit the archetype of the hero? Were they inverting this archetype? And so, be it kind of the classic Greek warrior Achilles, or Theseus, or Jason, or Perseus, or a figure like Mulan, who's kind of a feminine version of the kind of the classic hero archetype. It all belongs to the same kind of soup. All right. So between Campbell and Jung, I think that's a nice way of kind of zeroing in on some of these broader ideas of how religious narrative, how mythic narrative work, and how they all bind us together, with perhaps without answering the ultimate question of why. How can that be? There is something mysterious about this. There's something mystical about it, and that's, to my mind, that's what makes it so kind of wonderful in a way as well, and also has kind of an air of the religious about it. So this is certainly something we can come back to when we start getting into some of the religious narratives of the living religions that we'll start to get into next week. We will. This is a template that we can come back to, and we kind of see how some of these things play out specifically. All right, that's all I got for you on this one. I will lecture at you soon.